Warm greetings to you, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part you're joining us from. You're welcome to the 10th virtual town hall meeting, the very last of this year. I am joined by a panel of very interesting people that are here to discuss our topic for the day: ending lockdowns, establishing viable social mechanisms beyond COVID-19. I will introduce our panel of five, starting with Professor Gigi Foster, who is an Australian economist, if I got that correctly, economic professor. We have Robert Fredenthal, who is a psychiatrist from the UK. We have Julius Churchill, based in Canada. He is a geologist by training and an author and blogger. We have Dr. Claire Greig that will be joining us shortly, that is a consultant pathologist, and Simon Senyonga, who is a Ugandan-based lawyer. Of course, not forgetting yours truly, Evelyn Naikoba, your host for today's discussion. I welcome each and every one of you. So let me just give a brief to today's discussion. All over the world, I believe that each and every one of us is awakening to a truth. We're realizing that we've probably been sold a lie. We've probably not been given all the information that we should have had over the past 2 years. And so we're here to kind of link our lessons, our experiences to viable solutions that should help us move forward. A lot of the information that is being streamed down from governments and publicized by the media is currently being faced with a lot of microscopic examination, questions, and analysis from the people. Obviously, there's a reason for that, and we're here to establish that reason. But more than lamenting about what has gone wrong, we're here to kind of find the solution that will help us advance forward, progress our livelihoods, help nations build themselves into more useful states, so to say. I'd like to invite each and every one of you that's tuning in to wear your thinking cap, share your lessons, share your experiences, but more importantly, share what your solutions to this whole situation should be and how we can progress better. If you were the president, if you were the politician, if you were the journalist, if you were, the economist, whatever you are, whatever field you currently are in, what would you do differently? But also, what would you do going forward? I'll be happy to interact with you in the comment section, to read your comments, to view them, as well as to know your mind on how we can move forward. So this is not only going to be interactive for us as the panelists and the host, but also with you guys that are joining in virtually, that are streaming in from wherever you're streaming in. Of course, as usual, please be sure to share this video with your contacts on and off social media. This is a very last of its kind, like I said, that we're discussing for this year, and would like to, send it off with a bang. The festivities are here, and I'm hoping that we can focus on the good, we can focus on the light, we can focus on the truth that could kind of help us project what our next year should look like. All right, so we're going to get into our discussion. My first interaction is going to be with one of our panelists that I believe will set the foundation for us, given that he might not be specific to any field regarding his overview on the whole pandemic situation. He's had a chance to write quite a bit. He's had a chance to study quite a bit, from the various fields, and has kind of put his mind together to share his opinion. And that is none other than Julius Churchill. Julius, we're delighted to have you.
Thanks so much for having me on. Really appreciate it.
All right. So Julius, like I mentioned, he's a geologist by training, and he's an author and a blogger that focuses on providing perspectives on topics essential to the healthy functioning of science and democracy. If you like what you hear from Julius today, please be sure to visit his website, juliusruchel.com. All right, Julius, let's start off by talking about your book, Autopsy of the Pandemic. Please allow me to read it so that I don't miss out anything. Autopsy of a Pandemic, The Lies, the Gamble, and the COVID-0 Con. In that book, you mentioned that you share your personal journey of how you moved from being consumed in a tsunami of, the whole COVID fear to breaking out of that bubble. What influenced that switch?
It was interesting watching the very early data coming out of China, and I completely was, pulled into it and thinking that that this was going to be a massive catastrophe. And yet our government didn't seem to be taking it very seriously. And so at that point, I started digging into the numbers and have lost my faith in the government's ability to handle it. But then as I was digging into the numbers, it actually, like right when the government was starting to take it seriously, I was realizing that the numbers didn't actually match the hysteria that was starting to boil up in the crowd. And so I seem to have been on the wrong side of this, right from the beginning, like sort of against the mood of the crowd. But the other thing that really woke me up was seeing the, like when John Ioannidis started getting hammered in social media as being this crazy kook, and meanwhile he's a biostatistician and was starting to question this. And I noticed that there was no pushback at all against his actual numbers. It was just a character assassination. And so even though I thought he was also crazy, I thought, well, let me actually have a look at his numbers to see whether like where's the basis of him being called out as being wrong. And then I couldn't find anything wrong with his numbers. And so that's kind of how I started waking up.
All right, very interesting that you mentioned that. Well, one would argue, especially because you have been one of the voices that has been very stern and very strong, trying to make a case against lockdowns. So, of course, you'd have a group of people that argue that it was only fair, to lock down. It was only fair to establish who's essential and who's not essential. It was only fair for the lockdown to be implemented because, the elderly were at risk. Why would you still think that even amidst all the different reasons that the governments across the world generally, really, against all those facts, so to say, that the governments gave, why would you still make a case against lockdowns?
I think even if this had been as deadly as Ebola and as contagious as the common cold, you don't have a right to control other people to make yourself feel safe. You only have a right to protect yourself and, put on a mask, stay home, do all of those sorts of things. But to take away somebody else's individual autonomy to be able to figure out how to navigate their own life is essentially reducing them to some kind of a slave. And there's many other things besides COVID. And if people cannot navigate the priorities and risks in their life, you're essentially making them your victim so that you can feel safe. And that's a violation of every legal principle that we've ever had in Western civilization.
All right. Julius, you mentioned that we're talking about autonomy of rights here. We're talking about individual rights. But some people would argue that a lot has been lost. Some people would argue that it's only fair. For example, let me make specific reference to the vaccination rollouts that are happening across the world. Some people would make a case for them. I think one of the things that we've had over and over again is that people should get vaccinated in order to protect not just themselves, but also to protect others. So even amidst your right to your bodily autonomy, where is the balance between protecting the society as a whole and enforcing your rights as, an individual?
I mean, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Nuremberg Code established very clearly that in order to be able to impose or to offer a medical treatment to somebody, it has to be voluntary. It cannot be mandatory. Because if it is mandatory, you no longer have the transparency and the debate that's required in order to ensure that there isn't a mistake. But it's also that you have to have the right to balance your risks and against the risk that you're trying to offset. Like there's a risk to any medical treatment, and there's also a risk to exposing yourself to a disease. And if you don't have the right to balance which of those two risks you prefer to take, again, like you're essentially being reduced to somebody else's decree, and you have no recourse then to call out a mistake. I mean, in the case of these vaccines, there's a huge difference in the risk of a child that has virtually zero risk of any kind of COVID complication versus somebody that is 85 years old and has leukemia. And so to impose a risk of vaccination on that child in order to save somebody that's 85 years old is a complete backwards way of looking at how this, like the informed consent is meant to work.
So would you think that, because, for the most part, we've heaped the blame on governments, we've heaped the blame on the media, we've heaped the blame on, say, health workers. Do you think that individuals have had a part to play in this hysteria that was kind of, driving towards lockdowns? Because at the end of the day, if the governments kind of impose something, but the people do not ride along that wave, then maybe there might be some sort of resistance. Do you think that the governments are purely to blame? Do we think that vaccine makers are purely to blame, or have individuals played a role?
Society as a whole is, I think, the ultimate, it takes the ultimate blame in all of this, in that, the government ultimately will reflect the attitudes of society. I mean, one of the reasons why the judges are completely not coming out against this is that they reflect the overall mood in society. And so there's sort of a post hoc rationalization as to why, they can impose all of these lockdowns through the courts. But I mean, in the end, society is the one that has to hold government to account when it goes off the rails, and that's not happening. Society has completely, embraced this idea of, acting in the greater good as opposed to defending the rights and freedoms of individuals. There's been a complete shift in society, I think, away from the, post World War II, rights centered around individuals, towards rights being, towards a greater good kind of thinking. I think it's called utilitarianism, where as long as you're, doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people, anything can be justified. And yet the irony is that the moment you do that, you're actually allowing yourself to do unspeakable horrors towards the minority because it benefits the majority. And that's where it's a complete reversal of all of human rights. There's actually a wonderful, from psychology, there's a wonderful little like dilemma that was brought up. It's called the bystander at the switch. And it's the idea of this runaway train roaring down the tracks, and there's 5 people on the tracks that are going to get run over. But you're standing at the switch, and you can switch the train onto a different track, and there's only one person on that track. And so the dilemma is, do you pull the switch? And in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was really clear that you do not pull the switch, because you don't have the right to sacrifice somebody and take away their rights for the benefit of somebody else. And yet now it's a pure mathematical thing that, well, as long as you're saving 5 lives, then it's okay to sacrifice that one. And the irony is that once you give yourself that power, you're probably screwing it up anyways, because you're probably actually hurting 10 other people that are further down the track that you can't see yet, which is what's happening with lockdowns.
All right. Speaking of rights and the bystander, the switch kind of problem, recently, I think last week, 10th December, we celebrated the International Human Rights Day, a day that was chosen to honor the UN General Assembly's adoption of the UDHR, which is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How well do you think we are honoring the spirit of that charter, which really caters to providing for humanity for all, taking into consideration the rights of everybody?
We're not honoring it at all anymore. I mean, in the whole lockdown scenario, we've essentially tossed that out. I mean, there's nothing in any of these charters or bills of rights that says that you have the right to suspend people's rights for safety or for hospital capacity or for any of those things. Like the idea of an inalienable human right is so that it puts a limit or checks and balance on how far government can go. The government's role is to advise, to make recommendations, and to have transparent debate so that you can convince people to do things that are right for them, but also so that the people can call out what the government is doing and force them to be accountable. And by suspending the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you've essentially eliminated the ability to hold government to account.
All right, thank you, Julius. Those will be your introductory remarks as we get into the discussion. I will be back to you as the discussion progresses. Right now, I'm going to move over to Robert. Robert is a psychiatrist in the NHS Mental Services in London, UK, working in mental health services. He has direct experience of observing how coercive practice in healthcare settings compound existing inequalities and lead to significant deprivations of liberty. Robert has written on this topic and participates in campaign groups to end the lockdowns and restrictions, which entrench medical coercive practice and unjust deprivations of liberty. Robert, you've heard what Julius has said. Rights of all individuals should be taken into consideration. The society has played quite a role in driving all of these mandates that have been passed down. So, firstly, allow me to welcome you formally to this discussion as we get into your thoughts on what is your general thought on, what has happened over the past 2 years.
Yeah, maybe I will take us back to when this all first started kicking off in the UK in kind of March 2020. And at that time, I was working in a community mental health service for older people with mental health difficulties and with dementia. And all these restrictions were being discussed, lockdowns were being discussed, ostensibly to protect the patients which I was seeing, vulnerable older people. And these restrictions just made no sense. They just wouldn't work in the lives of the people that I was seeing. People with dementia, for example, who rely on a routine, who go to day centres, for example, or go to religious community, and how that is fundamental to their sense of well-being and to the needs of their carers. And all of this was just being ignored. It was just forget about that. We'll just kind of tell people to stay at home, and it just made no sense. So it was right from the start. It was apparent to me that these restrictions that were being discussed were being designed for people who had the ability to freeze their lives for a period of time, to stay at home, to work from home, and had the kind of emotional and psychological stability to be able to do that. But clearly that's not the case for huge proportions of the population. And as it sort of went on, I sort of thought to myself, gosh, this is all really based on a fantasy that it's possible to freeze one's life for a period of months or longer, and then pick it up again and everything will be okay. And we know that's not how human society or human psychology works, even for those of us in very stable situations. I mean, if you add on to that a progressive illness like dementia, well, these months are precious. You might never get them back. And by the time you come back in a few months' time, your cognition may have declined such that you're not able to recognize family members, for example. So right from the start, I thought, okay, these restrictions that are being discussed are not being made with the interests of the people that they are designed to protect. And then when you add on to that this what I consider to be kind of a paradox, I suppose, of healthcare services, which is very obvious in psychiatry, but it is also true, I think, in the rest of healthcare as well, which is that there's this kind of split view, I suppose, of healthcare. On the one hand, healthcare services are, in the UK context and elsewhere around the world, a foundational part of the welfare state, providing healthcare for people that need them, free at the point of use, hopefully. And then there is the aspect of healthcare where it's a structure of incarceration and surveillance. And that is very obvious in psychiatry, where people are obviously detained against their will for extended periods of time. But it is also true in nursing homes and in other areas of medicine where healthcare is used as a way of depriving people of their liberty. And sometimes, we know that in all societies there will be times when deprivations of liberty need to happen. I don't think any society has ever been able to do away with that. But there are very important legal principles about safeguarding those deprivations of liberty, which already weren't working that well anyway. We know about the racial inequalities in many Western countries in terms of who gets detained by the state, who ends up in psychiatric hospitals, who ends up in prison. Disproportionately, certain sectors of society end up in those carceral environments. So we know that those safeguards weren't working brilliantly anyway. And then you add on this whole culture of incarceration, of lockdown, of stay at home. And we know that when you introduce that carceral language, that carceral culture, the people whose deprivations of liberty are going to be restricted the hardest are those that already are vulnerable to having their rights removed. So it wasn't, middle class professionals who live in their own homes. fundamentally, yes, there were lockdowns for those people, but they could still pretty much go out and about. They could break the rules and know that they're not going to be stopped by the police. But that wasn't the case for people in psychiatric hospitals who already have their liberty deprived. And then that was then compounded by, for example, having their rights of having visitors removed, leave removed from the ward, and all these kind of deprivations of liberty just compounded one another in carceral environments. And I understand in prisons that was the case even worse in psychiatric hospitals. And this also included things like being admitted to a psychiatric hospital. You would hope that that would be a therapeutic environment where there could be time to have peer work, to have group work, to work with other patients, and do kind of therapeutic activities on these environments. All of that went with the restrictions. So psychiatric care just came about giving medication, and that was it, because all the kind of group programs were removed or kind of restricted during these times of lockdowns. So that was the kind of perspective in which I entered into this, was thinking, gosh, it just doesn't make sense really in the lives of the people that need to be protected.
Okay, so what approach do you think should have been taken, especially because it appears that from the onset of the lockdown, it appeared as though only the scientists and the politicians had all the answers. And yet we realized that over the past couple of months, there have been quite a number of effects, very grave effects that probably could have been avoided. So what approach do you think could have been taken?
So I think first of all, there needs to be some general principles that underpin any emergency response. So that includes taking a multidisciplinary approach. So not just asking scientists and politicians, but bringing in the whole spectrum of expertise, including community leaders and the other democratic routes that we have for getting people involved in decision making. So that's one thing. And then I think if you are going to go down the route of deprivation of liberty, then you need to adhere to some really important, well-established safeguards and principles whenever liberty is deprived. So that includes making sure people have access to advocacy, that deprivation of liberty is time limited, that it's always the least restrictive option is used first. These sort of general principles, which are already embedded in most kind of legal systems, were just seem to, as far as I can work out, be thrown out of the window. They were abandoned. So those principles need to be thought about, and then from in terms of what the response could have been. I mean, I think the general kind of response from a healthcare perspective probably should have followed a line of support before restrictions. So initially, and there are all sorts of creative things, I think, which could have been done. I mean, some fairly kind of standard policy things like improving sick pay so that people could stay at home and didn't have to go to work when they were unwell, for example, is one obvious thing. But there could have been all sorts of interesting things about creating and supporting community organizations to work, to continue meeting, continue functioning, but perhaps functioning outside, for example. Could have been one way of providing support and access so that people could continue to meet and organize and meet their communal needs safely. And instead what we've had is a complete destruction of community life. And I also know this because outside of my professional role, I'm also chair of a religious community. And it's been really difficult for us as a community to be able to find space to meet, because lots of the public spaces that would previously have been used and rented for low cost, those spaces have now been removed. They're considered not safe to be rented, and so small communities are being forced to rent private spaces, which is either unaffordable or unsuitable. And it's just a little sort of example, a little microcosm of how how the approach that we've taken has both undermined community, but has also facilitated this transfer of life from the public into the private. It means that the public space that previously used to be there is gone, or is heavily restricted, and communities and individuals are being forced to transfer their life and their relationships into the private sphere. So I see this as really damaging. And then what we're seeing now in the UK, and I'm sure in lots of other places around the world, is it's interesting what Julius was saying about not respecting the individual, which I think is absolutely, clearly right. But I also think we've completely lost our sense of a communal life. It's as though community just doesn't really matter. All of for quite a long time, these restrictions were framed as economy versus health, as though all our societal relationships are only thought of in economic terms, rather than in the absolute importance for our mental health and our just state of humanity is about being together in community and living with others. And that sense of community has just been completely destroyed. And so in a way, I see that a lot of the responses is actually sort of paradoxically based on an individualism. It's based on controlling the individual rather than investing in societal structures like expanding healthcare services, for example, or making the healthcare service a place that people want to work and continue working there, rather than introducing policies which is likely to lead to staff being laid off.
All right. You mentioned that we seem to have lost our communal life. One of the things, in one of your writings, you mentioned that masking destroys communal life. Just how does that do it?
Yeah, so I feel that wearing a mask is going to mean something different for all of us, and I think this is sort of fundamental as well about our general approach, is that we all have our own individual relationship with healthcare and healthcare intervention. There's going to be as many responses to the pandemic as there are people on this planet. And so masking will mean something different for all of us. And given that we know that as a medical intervention in terms of how effective it actually is in reducing transmission, we know that the evidence for that is weak to non-existent, I would probably suggest. So that there's lots of room for us all projecting all sorts of different kind of symbolic ideas and understandings onto what it means to wear a mask. So I suppose I would kind of answer that in two ways. There's one which is sort of the healthcare kind of communication side of things, which is that wearing a mask is like similar to how deprivations of liberty are experienced more significantly by people who already have their liberties deprived. Masking is experienced as more challenging by those who already have some form of communication difficulties. So if you have a cognitive impairment, for example, or if you have a sensory impairment, or if you have a psychosis where you are prone to paranoia, then clearly wearing a mask is going to be hugely difficult. And so on the places where I work, for example, at the moment I'm working in an older adults psychiatric ward, masking just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't work. People can't hear what you're saying. People may have psychosis. People try and wear them, I suppose, but they normally take them off when they're seeing patients, because it doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. But then from a more from that sort of community perspective, I feel that masks have become a symbol for reminding us that we're living under attempts to build a surveillance authoritarian state. So which is where our primary relationship is with the people in power, with the government, and not with one another. And so masking prevents or at least rather reduces our ability to communicate freely with other people who we might be living in community with, and encourage us to consider that our primary organizing principle for our behavior and how we go about our daily lives is that which is dictated to us by government. And I'll just say one thing. I just want to say I kind of have a note of hope, which I've written about this before, but I find this very helpful for myself, which is that I do feel that fundamentally surveillance societies and authoritarian societies where our primary relationship is with the government and not with one another are fundamentally weak, because our community lives, our relationship with each other is always going to be stronger. That kind of interweb, that kind of beautiful interweb of all those different relationships that you'll have in a community with so many different people is always going to be stronger than that one individual relationship an individual has with the government. And the government can only impose this kind of surveillance and authoritarianism on people that are willing to have that imposed upon them. And for me, I've had a lot of hope through this period, because clearly there's groups of people that the state has significant control of. So people in carceral environments, most obviously, nursing homes, prisons, psychiatric hospitals. The government can make those people's lives an absolute misery, and we know that's happened. But there are communities, whole communities of often minority groups, interestingly, or working class groups, where the lockdowns and restrictions have not made sense in their lives, and their sense of community is stronger, and they have resisted it. And they may not be turning up to protests necessarily, or even logging into calls like this, but that are just not hanging off every word of what the government is saying. And it's been helpful for me working in a mental health service where I work across society. And during the lockdowns was working in teams where I do lots of home visits and so on, and could see that the restrictions didn't make sense in the lives of the people that I was working with, and also they were in their own ways, or a whole variety of different ways, were kind of resisting as well. So I do feel quite hopeful about that, that ultimately surveillance societies can be built, but they're ultimately never going to be long lasting.
All right, thank you for that, Robert. Just one more question. We cannot talk about communal life, we cannot talk about community without making mention of places of worship, or churches for that matter. You mentioned that beyond your psychiatric career, you are a leader within your religious society. Obviously, talking about multidisciplinary approach, we cannot overlook the role that churches have to play. And as you rightly mentioned, over the past 2 years, we've seen quite a number of places of worship literally surrendering themselves over to governments, closing their doors, when people needed them the most. Others attempting to impose even more stringent restrictions than the government ordinarily would. So, in your opinion, what do you think should be the role of churches or religious institutions in managing such crisis, but also kind of limiting the impact of the powers of the government?
Yeah, this is something that's very personal to me, and I've really struggled with this, with the role that how religious communities has responded to the restrictions. And there's of course been a whole range of responses, and there are some religious communities which have resisted locking themselves down and some of the restrictions, but by and large many have gone along with it and imposed them even harder. I mean, I feel that maybe I'll say a couple of things about my approach to it, and then maybe offer a suggestion for why religious communities has responded in this way. But that's just my own personal perspective. I mean, for me, I feel religious communities, alongside their value in just building community, fostering intergenerational relationships, and living out lives with one another, I feel they have there's two other kind of very important functions which have been kind of discarded. One which is of course providing a sanctuary and a place for vulnerable people to be able to come and be, and that's clearly from the perspective of a church, that's been a historic, an absolute historic function of a church has been to provide asylum for people that need it, and somehow that has been lost. And then the other, my own personal theology is very much rooted in being in relationship with the divine, for example, or with other community members, and this has this sense of hold the authority, hold the power, hold God, whatever language you might use for thinking about that, hold those things close to you, is is a kind of fundamental part of my own personal theology. And I feel alongside being in contact with our mortality and the reality that life is fragile and short, and that our death is going to come for all of us, obviously in shorter or greater lengths of time, and the sense that that spiritual guidance which many of us seek, it has been missing. I think it's been quite hard to find a religious leader that's willing to give a sermon along these lines, even though I think the theological arguments are there to be made. And that's been a source of great personal disappointment for me. So in terms of why this has happened, I can speak to the UK context. Obviously, I'm sure in Uganda there may be some similarities and probably differences as well. But I've seen this across the board, which is that institutions have been unable to advocate for people that they claim to be representing. So if you are a religious leader, you'd think, okay, well, I would have thought that you'd think, okay, our job is to represent the interests of the religious community and stand up for the really important role that religious community plays in people's lives. And somehow that hasn't happened. But I've seen this elsewhere. I've done some training in group psychotherapy through an institute in group analysis. And they also, this is an institution that is the reason for its existence is to promote group work and group psychotherapy. And they have been all too willing to submit to the restrictions, but also, interestingly, for a psychoanalytic organization, have been unwilling to think about the psychoanalytic meaning of some of the symbols that have been introduced into our lives. So I think, okay, well, what's that about? This very thoughtful institution that would interpret and offer psychoanalytic ideas about all sorts of areas of our life. Why have they been unable to do this? And the only kind of hypothesis I can have, I suppose, two. One is that the world has lost their mind. That's one way of thinking about it. How have we've all just been living these really individualistic, isolated lives that makes us more vulnerable to thinking in this kind of way. That and there is a real draw to paranoia, to seeing every individual as a threat. That kind of, we're all vulnerable to paranoia in different ways, so maybe it's that, or perhaps another thought is that it is putting some kind of class analysis into it, where the people who are running institutions tend to be those who are economically privileged and from more kind of middle class backgrounds, perhaps, where are more vulnerable to who don't therefore need to rely on or depend on community in the same way that others might, and therefore may be more vulnerable to this kind of isolationist way of thinking. But I definitely don't have the answers, and I do feel that as time goes on, I think some of these institutions will respond, and I can see that in the UK context things are changing, and I'm hopeful that with time that we can, that some of these institutions will find their voice, and particularly that religious leaders will be able to as well.
All right. Well, I hope they're changing. I'm just reminded of, I think it was a case I read recently, maybe Friday, where there was a magistrate that cancelled a £16,000 fine that had been imposed on a church for conducting car park services. Here was a church offering help, food to vulnerable people, most of whom have been on the brink of suicide. And I think it was in Feb this year, police reined in on them and imposed that kind of fine. So hopefully, we court systems, if and when such matters have to progress to court, they'll have the decency, to advocate for the church, because it plays quite a role. But we can't help but wonder why a church that's offering help, to people, offering food, emotional, physical, spiritual support, would have such a heavy fine imposed on them. But maybe when I interact with someone, I'll ask him a couple of questions on that in the Ugandan context. So Thank you, Robert. I'm going to move over to Professor Gigi Foster. Professor, you're welcome to today's discussion. Gigi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much for having me. I've really appreciated hearing Julius's and Robert's comments. They're just very, very educative and very uplifting.
All right. Professor Gigi, we're going to crunch some figures. You've been quite vocal in your interviews. I was speaking with Robert about masks, and the destruction of communal life. I think in one of your interviews, you mentioned that instead of masking up, it's high time we face this head on and, go back to a normal life. So Professor Gigi, I'm sure as an economist, you're aware of the impact that the lockdown has had on livelihoods and families, on the general state of well-being of people, not just in Australia, but across the world. The extreme poverty rates have gone up, according to World Vision and UN reports. Unemployment rates have gone up. I think just in Australia, I think it went up from 4.6 to 5 point something in just 1 month. And yet, there's still that narrative pushing for the lockdowns. My question to you would be, from your observance of what has happened, the businesses collapsing, so many people getting out of employment, the deaths as well. Why would you still advocate, for lockdowns being done away with?
That's the question, Evelyn, is why do we still continue with this madness? Very similarly to Julius and Robert at the beginning of this horrible era, I too was looking at the data and thinking, well, wait a minute, this is a storm in a teacup. It looks like it's a nasty new bug, but it certainly is not the sort of fearsome pestilence that one would be led to believe if one were to go and knock on someone's door randomly on the street in Sydney at that time in March and April and say, well, how dangerous is COVID? People were absolutely terrified. And the thing that I didn't expect really is that terror did not fade, because in the end, it wasn't only an individual phenomenon. I think one of the real lessons for me out of this period is that it is possible for something completely irrational to take hold, not just of a person's mind, but of the mind of a crowd, of a whole crowd of people, right? A herd, as they say, a herd mentality can form, and it can perpetuate itself, particularly on the back of the international media that we have, and just the ways in which we have deprived ourselves, I think, of community connection and meaning in our lives. We seek out that meaning in other ways that are particularly vulnerable to being misguided by an obsession that has no basis in reality potentially, and that taps into our most dangerous emotion in a way, which is fear. It's also, of course, one of the most understandable emotions from an evolutionary perspective, if you want to think of it that way. We do need to have a fear response so that we can quickly make an assessment and disregard everything else except the thing we fear in order to save our life in a real crisis scenario. But fear also paralyzes us and makes us blind to everything else that matters in normal times. And the thing about economics that many people don't understand, particularly those who aren't economists, but even some economists don't understand it, is that the maximand of our entire discipline is not money or profits or the stock market value at any given point. It is human welfare. It is human well-being. So we are looking in economics to provide recommendations to policymakers which will maximize human well-being. That is what we are supposed to be doing. That's what we're supposed to be providing on our taxpayer-funded salaries, usually. And similarly to your previous guests, what I have observed in this period is that my profession has almost to a man failed in that responsibility during this period. And I've written articles about that. I've written this book called The Great COVID Panic with a couple of like-minded economists. And, we essentially try to understand why it was that we, as a world, flipped into this psychosis that we are still in now, and how bad the damage was of that psychosis, and then of course what we can do moving forward. On the topic of how bad the damage was, it has been an absolute humanitarian catastrophe, as you alluded to just briefly. But I mean, in the developing world, it's just unbelievably awful. In the developed world, it's also extremely bad, and we just haven't heard about these costs of the restrictions imposed upon us by the people who have been imposing the restrictions. And in normal times, again, what is typically done when a policymaker puts in place some sort of new policy is that is accompanied by a cost-benefit analysis, an evaluation of what it is that you expect to get from this policy, and a defense that is going to be better than the cost, that the benefit you're getting from the policy is going to exceed the costs. And we just have not had that in this country or in many other countries. And the reason for that, I believe, is that if you actually start looking at the numbers seriously in terms of the costs and benefits of lockdowns, just as a simple example, one restriction, the lockdowns, you immediately come to the recognition that they couldn't possibly be delivering the benefits relative to costs that would justify their imposition. So I think the problem is that those cost-benefit analyses were simply not done. They were not called for by the economics community broadly. I did one here for the Victorian government, 4-page sort of proof of concept, but it was never taken up or expanded. I'm working on one now for all of Australia, expanded, which I'm hoping will be done by the end of the year. But, I have been, and this is the same, I'm sure, for many other resistors around the world. I've been pilloried, I've been bullied, I've been defamed on Twitter, even though I'm not on Twitter. I've had death threats. I've been basically made to be a pariah in my own profession in many ways. Now, there are great friends and family members, of course, whom I have, and some economists, a few who have defended my right to have an opinion, and even a few who have come forward with similar opinions, but very few and far between. And so, the reason, I scratch my head like Robert does about, why is it that we just haven't seen the pushback, in my case amongst economists, but in his case amongst the religious communities, the religious leaders. I wonder about it, but I also think that it is largely this crowd psychology, which everyone is vulnerable to, and particularly if they are possessed by that fear and really have a strong sense of wanting to belong with the group. They want to go along with some group, and it's the group in power, the politicians, who themselves were pressured to embark upon these policies because the populations were so very scared. And then the politicians, particularly in Australia, have really painted themselves into a corner, and there's no way out that they see other than these massive vaccination campaigns. Because if they open up the borders in Australia and COVID comes back, and they can be accused of not having done everything possible to protect the population from COVID, then the population will punish them. Now, I'm hopeful, as are your previous guests, that the resistance is growing in strength and numbers. It's very hard to tell. I don't believe many of the polls out there, and there aren't that many polls on important questions. But I have a feeling that the resistance is growing a bit. Is it growing enough to be able to, use our democratic processes to change the leadership in the next elections? I really don't know, but I don't actually think so. I think it's going to be another couple of years that we have to wait until this kind of mania fades, unfortunately. And I say that based on also an analysis of history, and the historical examples of crowds are not pretty, and they take a long, long time to fade.
All right, Doctor. I always called you Doctor. Professor Gigi, you're talking about statistics. You've had a chance to look at them. I believe politicians have had a chance to look at them, especially them, economies collapsing, extreme poverty rates. As we speak now, I think we have 124 more million people that have hit the extreme poverty rate. And that is people not just who have a low income, but people who can hardly afford to sustain their lives with the most basic of needs. We have over 200 million people that are out of jobs. with politicians looking at these statistics, but yet they still push for certain agendas. Is there more to it than meets the eye? Is there something in it for the politicians that they ignore the statistics before them? I think currently the global statistics of COVID deaths are at 5.3 million people. And of course, that is not to say that we undermine the effects of such deaths. But if we look at the people that have been out of jobs, if we look at the people that are scratching for something to eat, and yet these are results of things like lockdowns, is this something that the politicians are ignoring, or are they fearful as well? What do you think?
Oh, I think that many politicians around the world are on a power trip, Evelyn. I think that they are absolutely facing incentives, personal incentives, to keep the narrative going and to keep themselves in power. Many health bureaucrats around the world during this period have enjoyed power beyond their wildest dreams, and they love it. Look at Anthony Fauci. Look here at Brett Sutton in Victoria. These people, would never in a million years have thought themselves likely to be elevated to the position of essentially grand chief, able to, control the movements of whole populations as if they were kindergartners. That is a really seductive, intoxicating feeling. Power is an aphrodisiac. And when we forget that, we do so at our peril. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes people angered about what's happened, because they once you see that picture of not, a government that is misled, that doesn't understand the statistics. We have to understand their difficulties in coming up with the correct policy. It was a difficult time and all this. No, they simply didn't want to lose the support of their constituencies, which were very scared. They needed to be seen to be doing something. That's the politician's syllogism. You have to be seen to be doing something. Here's something, let's do that. It doesn't matter whether it's connected to the objective. It just doesn't matter. As long as the population is scared enough about the thing, you can pretty much sell anything. And then once you've got that power, oh boy, does that feel good. And does that taste good? Does that give you more status and more glory? The more that you are seen to be the protector and the person and the group that can deliver on the promise of, zero COVID or whatever other fantastical statement was being made. So, the statistics are there. They're being censored to the extent that, that is possible, but there definitely are still sites where you can get the real data. But many, many people, even educated people, are not looking them up, and they still have this sort of belief in the correctness of this, this public health narrative, which is not at all about doing the right thing for public health. It is the wrong thing for public health to lock down healthy populations for all the reasons that we've been talking about. And that is something that we enumerate in this book. Actually, we use a currency that my co-author, Paul Freiters, just recently invented up at the London School of Economics with a team there, called the well-being year, which is essentially, it's a measure, it's a currency that we can use to capture many of the costs of lockdowns, which are not captured well in the traditional economic measures like GDP, for example, or the unemployment rate. So one of the big costs of lockdowns is that you destroy people's social connections, you destroy their ability to go to work and contribute, you take them away from their families, you isolate them, and that causes incredible mental stress because we are social animals. And as Robert says, we need those relationships with other humans. That's arguably the biggest, joy in life. And so when we do that, when we take those things away, we cause damage. But it's very difficult to get a measure of that damage using traditional economic tools. And so the WellBe does this. And the WellBe is built on a question that's asked in social science surveys all around the world, which is overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? That question is answered on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being not at all satisfied and 10 being extremely satisfied. And when people are in lockdown, data shows now, because we have collected the data during lockdowns and we had it beforehand, that answers on average to that question fall by about 0.5 of a point. One WellBe is 1 unit on that 0 to 10 scale, enjoyed for one person for 1 year. So essentially, if you aggregate up the cost of lockdowns across all of the people who were locked down in the world, there is an enormous amount of human suffering that has been inflicted. by these lockdowns directly. It's not the virus that has done that. It is human policy choices. And of course, the politicians' stories, in order to, again, defend their position, their power, and their history, their place in the history books, will be that it was the pandemic that did this. It was the virus, it was the thing out of their control, which caused that damage, which caused the economic disruption, which caused the disruption of schools, which will, of course, have caused cost to our children that they'll be bearing for the rest of their lives. But in fact, it is not the virus. Again, one of the things we do in the book is to analyze countries that had very strict restrictions compared to those that had very few restrictions and those in the middle. And we look at what happened over time to COVID deaths with COVID. And what you see is that actually the most locked down countries, the most draconianly restricted ones, which we call COVID cults, for good reason, it was a religious reaction, not a scientific one, have the greatest numbers of deaths with COVID. And I laugh, but I mean, it's tragic. And so in a sense, what was happening, if anything, was there was a reaction, not from lockdowns to lower deaths, or from lockdowns to higher deaths in COVID cases, but it was really that there were high COVID cases and other signals, and people got scared, and then those countries locked down. And 90% or more of the deaths actually happened after lockdowns. So, one of the fundamental misunderstandings in statistics, as you may know, is the correlation versus causation paradox, right? Just because two things go together doesn't mean that one caused the other. And that's the case, unfortunately, for lockdowns and COVID deaths. So yes, I think politicians will continue with this narrative for as long as they can possibly do it. And we will need a new generation of leaders, a new cohort of leaders, in order to really fully escape this madness.
Okay. Well, you could say politicians have vested interest, but let's talk about businesses, private businesses that seem to have sprouted quite a bit, during this COVID period. We have businesses like, we have big tech, we have big media, we have big oil, we have big pharma. One could say they're just doing their job. I mean, pharmaceutical entities are producing vaccines. Big tech is helping people stay in touch. But yet, we've seen quite a bit of their presence, very strong presence, in kind of pushing this narrative. Would you say they also have something in it, or they're just doing their work?
Well, again, of course, they have something in it, right? They are making money hand over fist, right? I mean, anybody who invested in Zoom in March of 2020 is now a gazillionaire, right? And of course, what you say is true. I mean, the vaccines were developed in record time, and, it seems that they may help some people at some times, at least if COVID is a really serious issue, if it's the most serious issue. But again, we don't have long-term data on them, and large swaths of the population are not particularly vulnerable to COVID in terms of serious symptoms and death, which is what matters, not cases, but serious symptoms and death. And so giving them a vaccine on which we have no long-term safety data when they have years and years left of their life to live seems to me to be a very risky proposition. But again, of course, the pharmaceutical companies, just like the media companies, will do what makes money for them. I mean, this is just a basic lesson in economics. And it's not that there's some evil genius planning this whole thing, like, oh yeah, or even a network of evil geniuses who have been planning all along for years and years to do this to everybody. I just don't believe that. The amount of coordination that would be necessary and foresight and amazing ability to predict, how people are going to react in strategically very dynamic and complicated ways is just far beyond the human capacity. So I just don't think that's what's happened. But do I believe that people in power will do what they can to stay in power? Do I believe that people who can trade with others and make deals in order to get more money, even if that means trampling other people's rights or other people's ability to make money, won't do those things? Of course they're going to do them. That's what people do. Unfortunately, people act in their own self-interest. That's one of the basic lessons of economics. So, I do think that the companies, the big companies that have benefited during this time have been part of the problem. And the excess concentration of wealth that we've seen was already not healthy for our societies, and it made us vulnerable to some of the more unpleasant effects of COVID. But at the same time, there are a lot of mom and pop businesses, a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, which have been very irritated and put out by these draconian restrictions. They've been, really having a horrible time, and they are part of the resistance worldwide. It is the complaints of people and businesses who would like to get back to business and back to normal life that will eventually put pressure on politicians. And those complaints will be louder the more that we can point overseas to examples of areas, regions, states, whole countries that have emerged from the madness and are now living normally. So this is one of the things I was speaking about with I think it was Julius before we started this call, is that it's wonderful that we have places like Florida and Texas to point to and say, look, you know what? They're opened up and having normal lives, and they're not having COVID Armageddon. And they seem to be doing pretty well. They're hiring people who have lost their jobs because of vaccine mandates in other states. People in New Jersey eventually are going to look there and say, hey, why can't we have that kind of lifestyle? What's wrong with our politicians? Why can't they give us that? So that kind of jealousy is a good thing in this case.
Just one more question to you. You mentioned earlier about something called the groupthink syndrome. How do you think we can get out of that, especially because so many people are still fearful? They're still, rolling with the narrative. How do we get out of that?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And this is the core issue for us right now, is how to reach people who are brainwashed, who've been caught up in this and just don't see it. A long time ago, someone studying crowds said men go mad in herds and they only recover their senses slowly, one by one. And I have noticed that myself, is that it's the one-on-one interactions with people who have been lost that really is where the change happens. Now, in terms of actions we can take, one action is actually to simply try very slowly to unpack individuals' misapprehensions, but that's very effortful. Maybe some of us can do that if we have time, but it's very effortful. One thing that works on a grand scale, if you can get it under people's noses, is humor. And I've been wanting to see more jokes and more, political cartoons and just cartoons in general about the silliness of what we've done during this period, right? Humor can really deflate fear a lot, right? It's one of the reasons why if you go on a date with somebody, if you can, make them laugh, you're always on a good track, right? Because that sort of reduces fear, reduces inhibitions, and it makes people just, bond together. And that's something we've been missing as well, right? So I would love to encourage all the resistance artists out there to please put your pens on, on supercharge and give us some cartoons, give us some great humorous, displays and visual images that we can display around the world. We can put them on posters, we can put them on stickers and put them in our grocery stores and on the street corners and try to get people to laugh again and to see the folly of the ways of the politicians during this period.
All right, thank you very much, Gigi. I'll get back to you later. Over to Dr. Claire Craig. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks very much for having me on. It's real privilege.
All right, thank you for joining this discussion. Our topic is end of lockdowns, establishing viable social mechanisms beyond COVID-19. So Dr. Claire, for our viewers, has been a pathologist since 2001. She worked in the NHS and reached consultant level in 2009. She specialized in cancer diagnostics, including diagnostic testing for cancer within mass screening programs, and was the day-to-day pathology lead for the cancer arm of the 100,000 Genomes Project. Subsequently, she has worked on artificial intelligence for cancer diagnostics. All right, so you are a scientist on the panel. Dr. Claire, I think one of the things that you've advocated for quite a bit is the SAGE model. It has been argued by some health experts, including yourself, that the WHO SAGE models have served as an avenue to justify draconian restrictions in the absence of holistic evidence-based research and findings, and continue to rely on a handful of assumptions, despite glaring failures. Before we can get into the alternatives, what is this SAGE model all about?
Thank you. Yeah, so the thing with the modelling, with all modelling, is it looks to an outsider and even to a scientist like a paper that's based on model data, just like real science. It has beautiful graphs, it has numbers. Often the graphs are more beautiful than real graphs from real science, because you can make them show whatever you want. It's all based on the assumptions that you're using at the beginning of the paper. So at the outset, the SAGE modelers didn't know very much about what could happen. And they had to decide, well, how lethal is this? How quickly will it spread? Who's going to catch it? Essentially, that's all that it was. You can do that sum on the back of an envelope. And any one of us could do that sum. How lethal do we think this is, and how many of us are going to catch it? And they made it look complicated. They drew lots of graphs to make it look more complicated. And then they came up with a massive number. So they estimated that 500,000 people in the UK would die if we didn't act. Now, what the message from Sweden that people often get a bit confused with is not to compare Sweden with its neighbours or with anyone else. The point is that Sweden didn't do all of these interventions. They didn't force anything on their public, and they did not have hundreds of thousands of deaths. So this kind of doom picture did not happen anywhere. And what we then saw was that the virus disappeared on its own everywhere. And it disappeared on its own with only a fraction of the population having had an infection. And the interpretation of the SAGE people for that was that there was still a lot of susceptible population out there that we must continue to protect. But there are other ways to interpret it. So the other way to interpret it is that the remainder of the population had adequate immunity for that variant. And so you see in the maths of the figures of how those cases rose and then fell again, that actually the rate of the fall was a constant, it's a straight line. And you only get that kind of perfect picture because the virus found fewer and fewer people who were susceptible for it to infect. You never saw any deviation of that straight line, thanks to government interventions and policy, because the biology was just continuing on the way it was always going to, regardless of what the humans were doing. And then we saw it come back in the winter, and the SAGE modeler said, oh no, we must have, and they never actually gave a reason why it came back, did they? But suddenly we all had to worry again that we were all susceptible and that this could go out of control all over again. But it didn't. And again, a fraction of the population was susceptible to the two variants we had over winter. And then it started to fall away again. And what we saw was excess deaths started to fall on the 19th of January. Now, we always see excess deaths in the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and they peak and then fall. And when they peak and they fall, changes from year to year. And if you compare it to 2017, the peak last year was about 10 days later. And it was also later than the average from about 2015 onwards. But it was earlier than the 2018 peak, and it was earlier than the 2019 peak. So you do have to question whether actually all the things we did last winter, which were quite draconian, made any difference at all to when those excess deaths peaked and started to fall. And even if it did make a difference, even if we say it did postpone it by 10 days, was that worth it? They were always going to peak and fall. Is it worth destroying society for a few extra days to slow that when that's going to happen? And obviously, I don't think it is. And what we've seen as these things have played out, more and more evidence has come in to back up the story that not everyone is susceptible to every variant that's out there. So a fraction of the population are. And that's a different model to the model the SAGE people have used. They've used a model that's based on a lot of infectious diseases. And it's the sort of measles model or the gastroenteritis model, where if you're in close contact with somebody, you catch it, and everybody was susceptible until they're immune. But there is another model, which is the model that we see with influenza. And people don't talk about influenza a lot because actually there's a lot we don't really understand about influenza. And one of the problems we've had throughout this pandemic has been real arrogance from the scientific community that they know everything about how viruses work, and they don't. We don't. There's a lot we don't understand. And with influenza, what we saw, let's take an example. In 1957, there was a novel influenza virus, which was called Asian flu. And the world held its breath at the beginning of that winter because nobody quite knew what that winter would play out like, because this was a virus that they were worried about because nobody had immunity to it. It was the same story, novel virus, this could be a disaster, it could be like Spanish flu. There was no interventions in terms of what people's behaviour was. Everybody carried on living. And there were more excess deaths than there had been in previous winters, but not to any kind of extreme. And then that influenza virus went in the summer, because it always goes in the summer, and it mutated and it came back as a variant the next winter. And some more people were susceptible to that variant, and they caught it, and some of them died. And it went again and came back the next winter. And actually, it sometimes skips a year, because that's the kind of thing that we just don't understand why it would do that, but it does sometimes skip a year. In the end, it takes between 10 and 11 years for an influenza virus to work its way through the whole population. And by the end of that, everybody's had it, and then it goes and we get a completely different influenza virus. And that does appear to be how SARS-2 is behaving. We're not all susceptible to every variant. And, it will come back every winter, and it will keep mutating and finding a way to find a more susceptible population. To be a bit more optimistic than that, we think we had a coronavirus pandemic before, in 1889. It was called Russian flu at the time, but there's an awful lot about that particular pandemic that does make us think it was a coronavirus. And there's also a coronavirus that is the common cold now that we know about, that does fit the picture. It could have been that was the pandemic back then. And they had 3 bad winters of excess deaths. And then I don't know whether the coronavirus was still coming back. It may have been, but the bad excess deaths were only 3 winters long. So that's a sort of more optimistic view about how much longer this might be.
All right. Thank you, Claire. My question would be, why is it that
Sorry, I can't hear you.
There's other kind of models are not being taken into consideration? You spoke about the influenza model. Why isn't it?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Evelyn,
now?
I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Right, that's better.
You can? Okay. My question is, you shared extensively on the influenza model. My question is, why aren't we hearing more of this?
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Okay, just hold on.
I'll just say one more thing from something that Gigi said that sort of reminded me of something an actuary did, a calculation they did, where they asked people, if you could trade being locked down for 3 months with years of your life, how many years of your life would you give up to avoid being locked down? And for some people, some people who actually quite enjoyed working from home and had a very comfortable life, had a nice home to live in, they wouldn't trade any of it. They had enjoyed it. But for other people who'd lost their businesses and who'd had a horrific time, they would trade quite a lot. And the medium amount that he found was, so I think it was something like 8 months, but it doesn't matter really. There was an amount of life that you could equate to the pain of lockdown. And when he did that sum, lockdown was not even worth it, even if it had stopped 500,000 people dying. It wasn't even worth it then.
Okay, can you hear me, Claire? Just
checking.
Claire?
Yes, I can, yes.
All right. So my question to you was, you shared extensively on the influenza model. Why aren't we hearing more of this?
That is a great question. That is a great question, and I don't really know the answer. I think there is this thing about being wrong, isn't there? People hate to admit that they've been wrong. So if you can persuade somebody that there was just a little mistake in their thinking, but everything else was right, then you can kind of nudge them along in a pathway until they get to somewhere closer to where you are. But the influenza model is a completely different model to the one they've been working on. So they need to rethink quite a lot of what's gone before, and that's painful and requires hard work. And when everyone else around you is going along with what you believe, why would you invest in that hard work? That becomes quite tricky. And I think that's part, also that being wrong is also part of how we think about what do we do to get out of this? How do we speak to people who are scared and get them to move to a position where they feel safer without denying all of their beliefs, because I just don't think we can win it by tackling every single one of their beliefs. And I think one of the ways that we could have done that, and maybe we still can do that, is with the story around ivermectin. Because here we've got a drug that can prevent and treat the illness. And so, yes, there is a horrible virus out there. Yes, it killed people. Yes, you had a risk of dying. But now we have a treatment. And so that everything you believed is still true, but now it's new, it's different, it's a new story. We can take it from there and start to build a future.
So you mentioned ivermectin. I believe you're aware that ivermectin has caused quite a row, not just in the scientific circles, but across. I think it was it CDC or was it World Health Organization that disregarded it totally? How do we get an alternative kind of treatment to kind of peer through and take center stage, especially in times where vaccine mandates are being pushed, and there are quite a number of questions that are not being answered around it, and all we're hearing or all we're being told is you've got to take the vaccine. There's hardly any information, especially in public channels, that pushes for alternative treatments like ivermectin.
So about a year ago, ivermectin was actually, to be honest, it was just a bit more than a year ago. We had Pierre Corey talking to the Senate, and we had, it was the big story that should have been breaking. And my peers who didn't embrace it, they were saying, well, we've got to be more cautious. You might cause more harm than good. We need to have randomized controlled trials. We don't trust, frankly, that. I think they're being a little bit racist about where the information was coming from, because a lot of the doctors that produce the data that we understand about ivermectin were doing so in countries with very little resources, where they had to find a solution. They didn't have ITUs, they didn't have other things, and they found it. They did great science, they published it, and then people in the West dismissed it because it was from a country that they didn't respect. It was awful. And we've had, since we've had scientists do meta-analyses of all of the evidence. So they've brought together all of the trials that have been done and showed what the effect is. And even if you want to rubbish some of those trials, and even if you say, well, maybe it's not quite as big an effect because maybe some of the data didn't make it into that meta-analysis, it still shows a profound effect. But we've had censorship and we've had attacks on the people who've been saying that. And then we had a counter-narrative meta-analysis which said the opposite. And it's out in the public domain now, a conversation between the people who led on those two meta-analyses, where one was challenging the other and telling him, what you've done is essentially fraudulent and wrong, and it's caused lots of people to die, and he didn't deny it. And it's just come out today that there was a £40 million bung of money to his university at the time when he produced that report. So but where we are now, of course, is that the people who are saying, well, we're not sure about this, even though it's a safe drug, and even though if it was only a tenth of the effect that is claimed, it would still have saved lives, they can't keep saying that forever, because in the meantime, they should have done some of that research. So where is it, right? Where is the research that should have been done since last year to disprove this fact? It's not there because they can't disprove it.
All right. Do you think that there's a chance that nations could adopt alternative models? Do you think there's a chance that, we could go past the lockdown measures, like you mentioned? The people or the parties that are kind of pushing against all these other therapeutic agents don't quite have substantial research to show for their positioning. But do you think there's an opportunity for us, now that people like yourself are opening us up to, considering another model, so to say? Is there a chance that it could be adopted, by other nations, having seen that the current one that's in operation has not yielded much result as had been anticipated?
Absolutely. And I think we don't have to wait too much longer before the trajectory of the disease is clearly, exactly the same as it was last year. And we've already got the Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, saying this is clearly a seasonal virus. And he's, you know, a COVID extremist. So it becomes undeniable once you've got that trajectory matching exactly what happened last year. Once you've got Israel having its second winter wave the way it did last year, then you can't deny that it's a repeating pattern. And that when you've got a repeating pattern, you can't keep claiming that that pattern is because of human events which have changed over that time and which haven't been the same. Obviously, it requires a certain amount of rational thought, which has been lacking. But I think there's enough people in the public who will just see that and not be able to deny it, because it's actually relatively simple, that phenomenon.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Claire. I'm going to move over to Simon right now. Simon,
Yep.
I'm going to start with a very simple question. Right about now, it's December. People are, you know, ready, excited, I hope, about the festivities, Christmas, the holiday break. But I read recently that a region, Gibraltar region, had cancelled Christmas celebrations. I think I've been watching different interviews with Joe Biden advising families on how to treat unvaccinated people, you know, not just for the Thanksgiving that just ended, but also the Christmas period. There've been conversations about, you know, do people gather for Christmas? How many people gather? How do you feel about that?
I think, first of all, it's a sad experience, because society generally finds its refuge in consistent association, but above all, the peak season of celebration is what demonstrates to us that we celebrate humanity, we celebrate togetherness, and we celebrate the various beliefs that bring us together. So the celebration of Christmas, not just about the Christian, but every national who realizes that there is such a unique season where we can get together and celebrate one another. So I was watching recently I was watching an interview, I think it was on Fox and Friends, and they were making an analysis of what's happening in the USA. I think Joe Biden recently said that I think that there must be a crisis of delivering of gifts. I think he was saying that in the USA, he made a speech and said that people should not hold him accountable if every family member does not get a gift. But I mean, the analysts were saying that Joe Biden is consistently hiding behind COVID-19 to defend a failing government system. And obviously, he uses he made a very, what people called a bad joke. And he said he can't make a promise of delivering all the gifts, only Santa Claus could make that kind of promise. So it was, it was causing a lot of backlash about the response of the president. But my feelings about the whole suppression of such moments of celebration, of such moments that bring together family, are summarized in what this discussion has been pushing for: the consistent clarion call for ending the lockdowns. Because never have we imagined that COVID-19 should be used as a scapegoat to deny us our fundamental rights. Now, in my view, the celebration of Christmas and such festivities is actually a key aspect in manifesting my freedom of worship. Because for me, it's not just about the celebration, it's about going to church, it's about going to a place of worship together with family, and we make reflection and celebration of the Lord Jesus Christ and divinity, which is a key aspect in guiding my worldview and guiding me in what I perceive to be truth and reality. The stand I have towards the end lockdown is shaped by my Christian worldview. So when you deny me access because of my vaccination status, because of my strong opinions towards the whole lockdown, nonsense, it eventually becomes a direct affront to my fundamental human rights.
All right, Simon, you called it nonsense, huh?
Yeah.
Well, It's interestingly, the reason why I mentioned the Gibraltar region is because it's the most vaccinated region in the world.
Yeah.
And one would think that where the vaccination rate is high, especially given the narrative that is being peddled, those should be the people enjoying their Christmas the most, not that anybody else should not anyway.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Uganda, Simon.
Yeah.
Robert, mentioned that the church is very dear to his heart. He observed that over the last 1.5, 2 years, churches have willingly given themselves over. They've closed their doors to the believers. Now, here in Uganda, we have, my observation is that we seem to have downgraded our God-given essence and right to worship to kind of a mere privilege. I think you have seen different interviews or, different public appearances by members of the Interreligious Council of Uganda, where, they were applauding the president for, removing restrictions on the church to, removing restrictions, but capping, those restrictions are capped. So you have 200 people that can gather. You have, our churches have been donated, their vaccination centers. We have them on different media stations or media channels advocating for vaccination. When did we get to the place of feeling privileged to gather to worship? How did we get there, Simon?
I think we got there the day we accepted that we need more of government and less of family and less of church. So what happens is that the situation in Uganda, you have many religious leaders who pay massive tribute to the current political leader and the current political system, and they owe their existence to the apparent liberty presented to them by the current government. And not only about the current government, but even I think previously, before the current regime, there's always been that sort of lack of consistency and the lack of steadfastness in making a firm stand about what we believe in. Because my right to worship, at least under the Ugandan Constitution, Article 20 states that my fundamental human rights are inherent. And I think this is language that is borrowed from international legal documents like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which makes mention of the nature of fundamental human rights, how they are indivisible, they are inherent, so the destruction of one leads to the other. So the context of inherency presupposes that my fundamental human right is God-given. It is not given to me by the state. Not even the Constitution gives me a fundamental human right. What the Constitution does is to state and protect and define the parameters of my enjoyment of the fundamental human rights. So the day we lost, the majority religious leaders lost the proper interpretation of what the Constitution says is the day we got into all this, again, as I said, the whole nonsense of paying tribute to only, government and failure to realize that actually our rights don't come from the state, but also the value system. So we are seated on a panel right now which is about 5 people from different walks of life. So you find that Professor Gigi's views are grounded in economics, and she will defend to the core her values to that extent. You find that you have Dr. Claire who will defend her views to that extent. You have Robert, you have Julius who are deeply ingrained. Their worldview is shaped majorly from their professional background. So what happens today is that there is a whole mix-up of trying to interpret our doctrinal values as Christians from various worldviews, and we are scattered. If only we go to appreciate what exactly the holy books talk about such situations, then we shall be able to stand firm and derive our strength, derive our perspectives from the holy books. And this was a conversation recently we had with when we had Geoffrey Tucker joining us on this discussion. The thing is that what would Jesus do in this particular situation? So Jesus would not lock people out of places of worship. Jesus would not distance himself from those who are affected by a plague. What he would do is that he reached out. Actually, he embraced. He made a firm stand against the existent authorities, and actually used extensive, used high-level language. So you are thinking about me calling this nonsense, but Jesus labeled the leaders of the day whitewashed tombs. He called them empty. He called them a pack of wolves. He called them everything that you would call derogatory and anything that would despise leaders. So what happens is that today we want to be very courteous when we are addressing issues which we believe, which affect actually our very core of humanity. So we disguise our ignorance and we disguise our fear in using courteous language. That's not what Jesus would have done. He was very blunt. But Jesus offered the alternative system, which was not just natural. He alluded to the spiritual essence of causing healing. And something that I think, this is a question I think you are asking, Claire, the relevance of seeking alternative medical solutions in a crisis. Jesus' alternative medical perspective was the use of faith. So what happens today is that we have put faith at the back of our journey, and we are somehow grappling over with all these feeble and fickle solutions. So that wasn't the perspective that you would have taken. Now, right now, what we need is religious leaders who can make a firm stand about what actually their beliefs are. Now, recently I was reading Candace Owens' book called The Blackout. She made mention of the fact that faith is a consistent thread that cuts across the entire value system of humanity. So even the values we espouse under human rights are grounded on faith. Our national aspirations and mottos of different nations are grounded on faith. It is the core value that drives us as nationals to reach out to our wildest dreams and realize them. That's something that the likes of Dr. Anthony Fauci have consistently attacked, and they'll consistently label those who make a firm stand about faith as zealots, as religious zealots, as COVID deniers, as anti-vaxxers, and all this kind of thing.
Simon, simply put, who should direct the course or the movement of the church? If we're not listening to the politicians who are guiding us, who then should direct us?
First of all, when you look at the value of the church, it is deeply linked to the recognition of a supernatural power, not just a supernatural power, but through Jesus Christ. And that's why I keep on making specific reference. So for me, I don't just talk about the church from the place of, science, economics, and all this. I think the church can participate and has to, shape narrative concerning that. But the core value is founded in the body, in Jesus Christ's values. And specific reference to this, Jesus Christ does not simply put his opinion in the letter. That's why we say, as a lawyer, I will tell you that the law is alive. What gives the law life is the interpretation of the courts. What gives law life is the activists coming up to have their perspective, to engage, to challenge, and to work the system. Right now, when you have the body of Christ, the letters of Jesus Christ, the works of Jesus are not simply cast in stone. These works are given life by the interpretation of the different preachers. And he says something very interesting. Professor Gigi was talking about how the biggest beneficiaries from the COVID money heist have been those who are majorly privileged. This was Jesus' perspective. So there was a story of a rich man and a poor man called Lazarus. So Lazarus dies a poor man, and the rich man goes to heaven. So the rich man goes to hell, Lazarus goes to heaven. Now, when this guy was suffering in hell, the rich man, he appeals to Jesus and says, look here, try to save me. I'm suffering in hell. I mean, we can see the destiny of the likes of Fauci, right? Trying to reach us, let's try to help me. I'm suffering here. this was the response of Jesus. He says that I have sent you prophets and wise men, and you have persecuted them. So what is happening today is that we are persecuting many of the scientists who are pushing for the lockdowns are persecuting the prophets, and they are persecuting the wise men who are actually supposed to be giving life to the letters of Jesus Christ, the word of God. So we label them all manner of things. We don't want to listen to them. So direction is by Jesus Christ, and life is birthed by the voice of the prophets and the wise men who have been given to us.
Okay, Simon. I'll make reference to an interaction I had with somebody recently. They told me that one of their reasons for heeding to every instruction from their leaders, their political leaders, they honor their political leaders, and the reason why they heed that instruction is because they take it from scripture. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. Now, Caesar is the political leader, so if the political leader instructs them, they will take that path. Now, I'm going to link that to, obviously we're preparing for the full reopening of the economy, and that will also include churches and other places of worship. I think you've seen in the media over the recent weeks, one, there's a lone vaccination that, what's her name? Honorable Acheng has been talking about that is due for tabling. Two, I think you've seen different politicians kind of allude to the fact that people might not be able to get into their businesses if they're not vaccinated, before Jan. I think most recently is one to do with border riders. They will have to have their vaccination by Jan, for them to continue in operation. How are churches prepared for that?
The first thing that the churches in Uganda are doing is to first of all challenge the status quo as it is. And that is why a group of, in Uganda we've had a very amazing group which has gone to the courts of law, in the High Court, the Constitutional Court, and the East African Court of Justice to challenge the COVID restrictions on the churches. And what they're saying is that you cannot deny the children and the elderly from accessing places of worship when you can allow the same to go to marketplaces which are heavily congested, no discipline, and no tracking or anything. So challenging the status quo is something very important. And again, I keep on referring you to what Jesus did. He challenged the status quo as long as it was not aligned to what the holy books were saying, to what God was saying about the situation. So our readiness has to be judged on, number one, how are we challenging the status quo? Secondly, on the firmness of proclaiming what we believe. So just like the economists are proclaiming what they believe for the economy, the scientists are proclaiming for what they believe for a firm medical ground, the church is continuously proclaiming and consistently pushing for the agenda of full reopening. And that's why some of us are refusing to, to give tribute to some politicians and who people think are doing us a favor to open up partially places of worship, and we are calling them our saviors. They have never been our saviors, they will never be our saviors. We know who our savior is, and we are not, we are choosing not to take that path. And, firm resistance towards the nonsensical approach of the lockdown is a very key tool in preparation of the churches, because that unveils the lies that have been used by the governments and the scientists to keep the nations locked down. So status quo, the firm resistance, and the continuous proclamation of the gospel of Christ towards what the nation has to be focused on. And I think the most important thing in terms of preparation is the clarion call for unity. So COVID-19 and the measures that are being used do not only affect us as Christians, they affect the Muslim, the Anglican, even the atheist. So what we are doing right now is that through such discussions, you're having everybody united towards a particular value system that is non-discriminative, irrespective of your religion. And that is a very key tool in terms of preparation, because then you have one voice which is championing the cause of a reopening. You have one voice which is saying separate the church and the state and make sure that you give more power to family, give more power to society, and reduce the power given to government.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Our time is fast spent, but I want to read some of your comments for those of you joining us live. Simon P. Wamahe, your namesake, Simon, says the current narrative of political and media bigwigs is to dismiss any dissenting view, even when empirical evidence shows otherwise. Simon, thank you for joining in. Bella Royal says, weren't we having conversations that advance treatment options, such as the use of ivermectin? She directs that question to Ministry of Health. Uganda. Walusimbi Stephen says, thank you, Dr. Claire. Semakula Semogere says, the big fish are the ones benefiting from the lockdowns. This was in response to Professor Gigi Foster's discussion. Otalo Brian says, COVID and politics. I guess he agrees with Professor Gigi. Then Amanya Lee says, at this time in past years, we would see Christmas lights and decorations on almost every street, but now it's hardly present. We look forward to these periods, and they're robbing people of every tiny thing that brings us joy and merry. On this note, I'm going to bring in Julius Churchill, just based on what Liz's comment is on what Christmas used to be like. How do we move on? Julius, how do we move on from these clutches of fear? How do we break free? You were able to, so you should be able to kind of guide us. How do we move away from that?
I think the most important thing is for everybody to be noisy about questioning this, I mean, mocking it, as Gigi said about using humor. All of these things it does two things. One is that it challenges the narrative, but more importantly, it also creates sort of it breaks the illusion that we're in the minority with what we're saying. That, like, I've used in my writing one of the analogies of, if you have a herd of buffalo racing towards a cliff, basically the one in the front is pulling the one that's behind forward just through that movement. But if all of a sudden part of the herd splits off and runs in a different direction, the ones in the back start to slow down because now they don't know which way to go. And so I think that's an extremely important point that we need to remember, is that it's not about all of us that are now speaking out, that we can't, there is no magic words that we have to be able to stop this. The only way that this stops is that if everyone else that's listening is also talking about it, so that we grow the numbers of voices that are actually challenging it, so that somebody that's caught up in this, there might be one person that challenges them and they're going to ridicule them, but by the time there's 10 people that have challenged them, all of a sudden they're not going to feel quite so certain that they're running with the majority of the herd. And I think that's really important. And I mean, in the past, the media was going to be doing a lot of that for us by giving context to different things, or providing transparency on numbers and stuff like that. But the media isn't doing that anymore. So in a sense, we have to all be doing that through just putting our voices out and saying, okay, this doesn't make sense to me, so that it forces everyone to start questioning it themselves, rather than looking to the media and the politicians as the holders of truth.
All right. So. Thank you, Julius. I have a question for Robert. The UK has been deemed to be one of the countries within Europe that's most intolerant to Christians. I think you're aware that starting, is it January next year, the NHS COVID pass will be a lot more compulsory. And I believe at some point they probably want to extend it to religious institutions. Already, you cannot go to certain indoor, outdoor avenues or venues that without that COVID pass. If you had a chance to sit down with spiritual leaders, religious leaders today, what would you say to them?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, I suppose there's two things there. One is the what is the impact of those sorts of vaccine COVID passes, and who do they discriminate against? Just for whether you wish to receive a vaccine or not, if you apply any kind of structural analysis to who those passes would be excluding, it's disproportionately, of course, people who are homeless, who are marginalized in some ways, people that don't have access to state bureaucracy or remove themselves from state bureaucracy, often for very good reason, as we've been discussing today. Those people being excluded. So I don't understand that. That's a key tenet of religious community, is about being inclusive. So it's not possible to run a community with the use of these kind of COVID and vaccine passes. So I would make that argument. And I've been really interested hearing the perspective of different people that have been talking today from a Christian perspective. I myself am part of the Jewish community, and these arguments can be made from, I think, any theological perspective you might choose to come from. So we've heard about them with respect to Jesus. I think from the Jewish perspective, there's this foundational value of questioning authority and asking questions. It's seen as being a core Jewish principle. So I would feel that solidarity, working with other communities where we have things in common, which we definitely do with this regard, and building a kind of united front to speak out for the value of religious community is just absolutely fundamental. I do have to say I have a bit of hope. I know I mentioned hope before, but I do have hope with this regard in the UK context. I know, Claire, you're also in the UK, and I'd be interested to know what you think. But I do feel that with regards to the lockdowns and our pandemic response, that each country has had their own sort of culture-bound way of responding. It's obviously not been uniform across the globe. And for example, there's some things in the UK where we haven't gone down the line of really kind of coercive and heavy masking as much as some other countries. We have been doing a bit and going down that way right now, but compared with the States, for example, or other European countries, and there is a kind of libertarian streak within the UK, which means I feel a bit more confident around kind of religious communities being protected. But for me, what's been the troubling aspect from the UK side is the dependency and leaning into surveillance and kind of border policy. That's been really damaging in the UK. We test more than pretty much any other country in the world, and that we've gone down the route of kind of biosurveillance, testing twice a week, testing every day. That is for me, is that kind of surveillance response has been the most damaging side in the UK. I actually feel a bit more optimistic about some of the other things, but I think we're in the UK, we're in this really kind of key moment right now where there is a bit of window for resistance, and I think that's where we need to kind of work on at the moment.
All right, thank you. Maybe I just have one more question, and this one is directed to Gigi. Gigi, the question to you is that with all the economic loss that has been impacted, is anybody going to pay for this? Is there any opportunity for truth and justice to prevail, for compensation for all these effects that have transpired over the past year?
Would that there were. I think if we look in history, we find that in general, the perpetrators of great harms to humanity do not generally face justice, and that the ones who have been most harmed are left to dust themselves off and find their own communities and their own faith and their own sources of support that have nothing to do with being given retribution or given restitution by those who have wronged them. Of course, there are some exceptions. We had the Nuremberg trials, and that did bring to some kind of justice, at least a very, very, very small percentage of the wrongdoers during the Holocaust. But do I expect that this time? What I actually am seeing, and when we've seen this around the world, is that over the last few months, particularly, there's been a kind of a slow departure of the politicians and the leaders in charge during this period whether they've been taken out of office, or they've resigned, or they've moved on to other things. And I think that is the beginning of them seeing the writing on the wall and not wanting to be on the wrong side of history, or not wanting to at least have to pay in their lifetimes for the betrayals that they have visited upon their populations. So I would like to see that sort of justice, but I doubt we will. But I do want to end on a more hopeful note. So I was fascinated and uplifted by Simon's comments in relation to, asking what would Jesus do. I'm myself also am not Christian. I'm a secular humanist, but in the secular humanist tradition as well, we see it as of utmost importance to put the needs of the human first, and the notion of community is very, very strong in what humans need. And I think that the fact that we've all come together and are speaking so passionately from our own perspectives on these issues, and that togetherness, that unity that Simon spoke of, is in relation to what we need to do. That is a model for our future. The idea that we should all have a mono vision and all believe the same way and all have the same perspective on what is happening, that's what got us into this problem, right? That kind of mono vision, that kind of, one thought, and that's the only thought one can have. That's what totalitarianism actually is. And that's what we've seen in so many countries around the world. We don't want that. What we want is people, as we are displaying here in this discussion, with very different perspectives and belief systems, but with strength and with passion and with a commitment to working together and engaging and facing together whatever crisis comes our way, and coming to a sense of what is the right action to take based on a critical analysis from all the different perspectives that must be considered if we are going to make policy that is in the best interest of humanity. And that is not just the best interests of the Zoom class or the laptop class or the politicians or the people who are of a particular age group or gender or race or anything else, right? It's everyone at the table. And so the suggestions that we make in, again, this new book basically are about trying to inject more diversity into the decision-making apparatuses of our institutions in societies around the world, so that we don't become so stupid so quickly as we did with COVID. And I think there's a chance of that, because I do see that the resistance in individual countries and worldwide is growing and is drawing membership from all across the professions, all across the different faiths, all across every walk of life, because we are united in our perception that what has been inflicted upon us is wrong, and there must be a different way forward. And we don't want to fall into that same horrific trap that we did at the beginning of 2020. And so I think if we all keep ourselves open and engaged, then hopefully we have a chance of avoiding this sort of catastrophe in future.
All right. Thank you, Gigi. Thank you very much for your contribution. Where can one find your book? You mentioned the Great COVID Panic.
Yeah, The Great COVID Panic. It's on Amazon. I do have copies here in Sydney, but I don't think I can probably send them to Uganda. But hopefully they can send from an Amazon site someplace near you. If you can't find any, then give me an email and I can have my publisher, who, by the way, is Jeffrey Tucker at the Brownstone Institute, potentially send you some.
All right, thank you. Our time is first spent. I'm going to request each of the panelists to give their parting shots, but as well let us know where we can find more of themselves or more of their information, starting with Dr. Claire Craig.
Thanks. It's been a great discussion, and I think Gigi summed it up beautifully in terms of everybody coming at it from different perspectives and working together and find, it's just been hugely challenging, and it's really difficult, especially when you've got friends and family who won't listen. And I think we've all had that problem, but I think we can learn from each other the best ways to approach that and the best ways to get the message out there. I'm on Twitter at Claire Craig Path, and I'm also co-chair of the Heart Group, where we produce a weekly bulletin you can sign up for to get into your email, just to give you an update about what's going on, but from a body of scientists who are trying to think critically.
All right, thank you, Claire. Robert?
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for such an interesting discussion. I'll say I would kind of echo what's just been said by Claire and Gigi, is that I'm coming away quite hopeful, because I think at its core, the isolationist lockdown ideology is a hollow ideology, essentially. It's based on something very vacant. And so whatever analysis you apply to it, whether it's theological, Christian, medical, psychiatric, economic, philosophical, any analysis you apply to it, it collapses. And eventually it will collapse under its own contradictions. Of course, we don't know what that collapse is going to look like, but I want to, and that collapse will come from us all bringing a huge variety and diversity of opinion and different perspectives. In terms of where you can find me, so I'm on Twitter as well, at Rob Freudenthal, and from there you can see where I've been writing and different blog posts I've been posting and so on.
All right, thank you, Robert. Julius?
I think I would also echo that. I think the most hopeful thing for me is that the folks on our side are now talking across every single, boundary that you can possibly find, across the political spectrum, across the religious I'm missing the word here, across the religious spectrum. Like, people are startingly talking and discovering all sorts of different viewpoints. And I think what we're doing is ultimately, it's the fun place to be, I think, and there's a point where living under lockdowns and oppression gets old, it gets exhausting, and that what we're doing is sort of providing it's sort of a refreshing of the values that we used to all hold dear, that have kind of slipped away. And I think that, the freedom is contagious. It's always going, in the end, we will win. It's just a matter of time in that sense. So I think that's, as long as we keep talking and we keep making noise, I think we will eventually pull the support pillar out from underneath this monstrosity. As far as where to find me, the best place is on my website at www.juliusruchel.com. And from there, you can find all my links to, on Twitter and a bunch of other social media sites. But my website is the best landing spot.
All right. Thank you, Julius. Simon?
Thank you very much. And I really want to thank all the panelists for the great insight. I am leaving this place a better person. I'm leaving this place a very hopeful person. I mean, I highly appreciate all the insight that have come in. On my side, I cannot leave without sounding the clarion call of faith, hope, and love. That's the most important thing that is needed in this situation, to reach out, for those who have suffered, reach out to them in love, restore faith for those who are, heavily burdened by the mandates and the response of the governments and the science and all these kind of people who are pushing for oppressive tendencies. And I think for me, it's to point people to to what I know and I believe as the final source of hope, who is Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior, and who I know we can all seek our refuge, especially in such situations which seem dark, but remain even firm to the values, to the message, to the mandate that He has given us to send out to the world and reach out to everybody, for them to realize that beyond just their personal efforts. I like what the book of Proverbs says, that the city, the watchman can watch over the city, but if God is not protecting it, then it's extremely useless. So in whatever front and for where we are being called as watchmen to watch over, the city, whether it be the economic city, medical city, or whatever city it is to realize that in and of our own efforts, we fail, but focus on the Lord Jesus Christ and God, then we are able to achieve a perfect purpose that can serve all humanity without discrimination and limitation to whatever worldview. And to find me, my Twitter is also good, at Simon Senyonga. That's my Twitter handle. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Simon. And finally, Gigi.
I would echo a lot of what's been said. I think it's very true that joy and happiness and freedom are just inherently more appealing than misery and fear. And so eventually the resistance will win, and we will win with love. I think that's the very important component is and the turning of the other cheek rather than the reaching out in anger towards those who have been brainwashed during this period, trying to love even those who have betrayed their populations, even those who have betrayed their professional ideals. We have to try to understand those people and help them through the process of restoration of their minds, and to hopefully keep them from experiencing too much self-hatred when all of this is over. And again, joy, love, freedom, and that has to win in the end. How to find me? I'm not on Twitter because I don't have time for it, or I don't make time for it. But you can find some information about the book on thegreatcovidpanic.com, and from there you can find who I am. And I'm at UNSW. We've got a webpage there, etc.
All right. Thank you, Gigi. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you for the insightful discussion, all the information, and thank you to our viewers. This cannot be, it takes two to tango, really. Thank you for your opinion. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing this with your contacts. Well, I hope you did. If you've not, please do right after this. It's been very interesting. 10 meetings of insightful information, of interactive discussions, of great panelists, and we've climaxed this off with this very delightful panel. So I want to thank each and every one of you for always tuning in. The light is coming through. We're breaking through. Obviously, we're not where we began. I believe you see it. And keep the faith, keep the hope, keep the love, spread it. It's a beautiful season to rejoice and celebrate Jesus Christ. So from my team and everybody that's on this panel, we wish you a pleasant Christmas, a Merry Christmas, and a blissful 2022. God bless you.